Culture Declares is a growing community of arts and cultural champions declaring a climate and ecological emergency. The crisis compels us to imagine new possibilities and to propose systemic change. We have a vision that the UK cultural sector declares and takes action on the climate and ecological emergency. We have a mission to grow and to support a diverse community of cultural sector declarers. And our values are to tell the truth, to take action, and seek justice in the face of the emergency. We'd like people to go to, oh, and the emergency is passing my door as we speak. I can't emphasize it further than that. Since its launch in April 2019, over 1,000 individuals and organisations have declared an emergency through CDE, and we encourage you to go to our website and read the fabulous text that Bridget here wrote that really sort of summarises and gives heart to you know, what we all feel inherently. So this evening we are welcoming, I've got so many things on my desktop here, Toby Litt, who is a leading author, published novels, short story collections and comics. His most recent book is Patience, a novel. He runs the Creative Writing MFA at Birkbeck College and blogs at www.tobylit.com. When he's not writing, he likes sitting and doing nothing, which I think we're all doing a lot of that right now. So right now I'd like to hand over to Toby, who is our host for this evening.
Thank you very much. Welcome to everyone. Welcome to all the audience who've joined us in my front room and other people's other rooms, and welcome to the writers who are joining us too. I hope I'm clear and audible, and I'm just going to speak for a couple of minutes about how this event came about from the point of view of Writers Rebel, and then I'm going to go straight to one of the contributors. So, during the lockdown, it seems almost as if the rest of the world has stopped moving, that nothing is going on, but lots of things are going on. And the kind of things that have drawn us here together, the anxieties about the state of the world, those things may have slowed down, but they're still continuing. And flooding is one of the most worrying of these. It's an issue today in central Michigan, but also places like Hebden Bridge, the Caribbean, Bangladesh. It's going to dominate the future. So we don't want to forget it. We are confined to our homes, but we are not passive. And so we want to react to this, and we want to imaginatively react to that. And this is what writers do. They tend to be fairly shy creatures. As a species, it takes quite a lot to provoke them, but this is quite a lot, and it's provoking them to respond imaginatively in the way that we're going to hear this evening. We've got a number of readers. They're all reading for between 5 and 6 minutes. There's going to be poetry, there's going to be stuff from the past, stuff from legendary prophets of writing. And we're going to be hopefully wrapping up around about 9 o'clock. If you have comments and things, please feel free to share them in the chat. That's going to be saved. We're going to be looking at that later, and the writers will be hopefully doing another event in which we can respond. So you don't need to tell me that this is a serious issue, but I hope it's going to be an inspiring evening, and also it's going to be one that's full of imagination and life. So let's get cracking. Our first speaker is Alfie, who's going to give us an action overview, going to talk a bit about people of the River Rise. Alfie's bio, which is a triumphant bio, says Alfie is Black, Jewish, queer, rebel and activist. And Alfie was one of the original organisers of People of the River Rise, which was intended for May 15th this year. And she's going to speak to us now.
Just want to say, number one, thank you for the introduction, Toby. And I'm very, very honoured to be with all these fabulous writers who are rebelling. I feel like I'm being very honoured to be with your testimony. Your testimony is going to be so important. Having these emotions connected to what we're trying to fight for is very, 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 very important. I'm just going to tell you a bit about Peoples of the River Rise, which really was born between myself and a friend called Olivia outside the courts of justice when we had just been triumphant in court about our section, I think it was section 14, which was thrown out. and we were talking about flooding that had been happening in the Thames, on the sides of the River Thames in London. And we basically thought that we would discuss about flooding to do with the Thames. We also have to say that we kind of ran around to loads of groups that were all very much situated close to the Thames or would be affected by flooding of the Thames. But we have to say it was all from the Thames barrier back up. We weren't looking at the other ends. And we kind of decided that this was an issue because we know there's ways of remedying this. We can't control what the weather pattern's going to do, but there are ways of mitigating this. But it's also about engaging the population who it's going to be most affected by. And Extinction Rebellion is in a perfect position to do that. Absolutely perfect position. The concept was, united by our love of our rivers and fear of the increasing flood level risk, we rise up in rebellion. Billions of people live on land that borders a river and is therefore particularly at high risk. We timed this rebellion originally for the spring high tides. There's a real connection with pagan roots in this country to water, the moon, the movement of water, the rivers edging in and out, and that was about the high tides. So we thought, with a pagan ritual, with all the groups along the river making some kind of protest, and some of them were truly inventive. There's something called some kind of extension to the sewage system. One group was going to dress up in poo costumes to show about the poisoning of our water. Another group was going to do some kind of play to do with the insurance companies not wanting to insure properties because of the flood level risk. There were some really quite inventive things. Even another group who wanted to bring down flood damaged furniture and try and recreate a room inside of their space. So truly, really inventive stuff. And then the biggie happened. The flooding started happening in the north, in Hebden Bridge, in Cardiff. And that's when Peoples of the River really got serious, because let's be frank, London has privilege. It's got the Thames barrier to protect it. And lots of other communities don't have that safety net. That's the number one thing to say. And the number two thing was, and I'm going to admit it, we didn't think of the north. We didn't think of Cardiff. I didn't think of Hebden Bridge. People lost their lives there. You know, that's how serious it is. And once you start going around the world, it's multiple peoples that are losing their lives. Whole towns, whole villages, crop systems goes. People aren't able to look after themselves. It's a rally cry that reaches around the world, because every major city has been made on a port. Because of the way that our capitalist system works, every major city is beside a river. There are some countries, and I've forgotten the name, I should have wrote it down when I was doing a little bit of research. One city's already moved because they know that the sea rise level is so bad, they've had to move their capital city away from where it used to be because it's moving now. So I'm going to try and wrap up a little bit now, because I feel like I'm coming towards my time. But what I really hope that everyone gets out of this, and these words, these are testaments. These are testaments. This is what's actually happened to people, what people are envisaging could happen to themselves because of water rising, and because of our, a better way I can say it, our lack of connection to the nature, lack of connection to the earth, not respecting floodplains that we shouldn't be building on, not respecting we can't tarmac everything, not respecting that we have nature which can help with flooding. This is all part of it. This is all part of it, and I'm really honoured, and I can't wait to hear what everyone in this wonderful Zoom group is going to come out with. So I'm shutting out, I'm pulling out, I'm leaving it to the experts.
Thank you, Alfie. That's great. That's passionate, and we hope to testify this evening. So we're going to start with Chloe Origis, who is the winner of this year's PEN Faulkner Award for Fiction, which is astonishing. That's for her novel Sea Monsters. She's written 2 other novels, published them, Book of Clouds, which won the Prix Premier Roman Étranger in France, and Asunder, which is set in London's National Gallery. Chloe is one of the key members of Writers Rebel, and she's going to be reading a poem.
Thank you, Toby. I'm going to read a poem by my father, who's a Mexican poet named Homero Aridgis, and this is a poem he wrote in the early 90s called Rivers, Los Ríos. So I'm just going to read the beginning in Spanish. It's not a very long poem. I'm going to read the beginning in Spanish, and then I'll read it in English. Los ríos. Naturaleza de los ríos es correr, y su verbo fluir. Han caído del cielo, de la lluvia o del cerro. Llevan en sus cauces sapos y sangre, sauces y sed. Algunos fueron concebidos en lechos de amor por mujeres mortales y dieron nacimiento a héroes, a tribus y a hombres secos de todos los días que los llevan por nombre. And now I'll read in English, Rivers. The nature of a river is to run, and its verb to flow. They have poured down from the sky the rain and the hills, their currents swollen with toads and blood, willows and thirst. Some were spawned in love beds by mortal women, giving birth to clans and champions and dry everyday men who carry them in their names. They are portrayed as a green body, legs entwined and arms spread wide, a changeable mirror that reflects an eye of fresh water that eddies swiftly away. For the people's adorations, a small altar was their due, not a temple. Oxen and horses thrown in for sacrifice, maidens garbed in the raiment of a goddess with a yellow face. That's my cat. Long ago, sparkling rivers ran through this green valley. Ash gray, chestnut, and opaline. Rambling, purple, and dull brown. Easily shattered, they squalled and clamored, down from the steaming mountain onto the lazy plain, touching an early Tenochtitlan. Today they grown, thick with black water and swollen with sewage, shrunk into conduits, ridiculous rivers without banks, their docked tails reined into lanes raging with cars, hurtling down through the deflowered city, reaching their mouth in lethal lakes, and the scarred sea that no longer loves them.
Thank you, Chloe. The next reader now is joining us from America. It's Jeff Goodall. He is staff writer, contributing editor for Rolling Stone magazine. Jeff is the author of a founding text, The Water Will Come, Rising Seas, Sinking Cities, and the Remaking of the Civilized World. This is a key text for those concerned about rivers and seas rising. He has covered the climate for Rolling Stone for over a decade. He's spoken on CNN, Fox News, and the Oprah Winfrey Show, and he is joining us now from America.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here. It's great to see people organizing, coming together, thinking about this. You know, when I started working on this book 7 or 8 years ago, there was nothing like this. People were still sort of unaware, and the sort of escalation of political awareness and activism around this has been one of the most encouraging things since the publication of this book for me. I just want to read a little bit from the opening, sort of to set the scene for some of the things you're going to talk about tonight, just about the kind of challenge that we face with this. Just a couple of pages. In this book, I want to tell a true story about the future we are creating for ourselves, our children, and our grandchildren. It begins with this: the climate is warming, the world's great ice sheets are melting, and the water is rising. This is not a speculative idea or the hypothesis of a few wacky scientists or a hoax perpetuated by the Chinese. Sea level rise is one of the central facts of our time, as real as gravity. It will reshape our world in ways most of us can only dimly imagine. My own interest in this began shortly after Hurricane Sandy hit New York City in 2012. I visited the Lower East Side of Manhattan, one of the neighborhoods that had been hardest hit by flooding from the storm. The water had receded by the time I arrived, but the neighborhood already smelled of mold and rot. The power was out, the shops were closed. I saw broken trees, abandoned cars, debris scattered everywhere, people hauling ruined furniture out of basement apartments. Dark water lines were visible on many shop windows and doors. The surge in the East River had been more than 9 feet high. overwhelming the seawall and inundating the low-lying parts of lower Manhattan. As I walked around, watching people slowly put their lives back together, I wondered what would have happened if, instead of flooding the city and then receding in a few hours, the Atlantic Ocean had come in and stayed in. I've been writing about climate change for more than a decade, but seeing the flooding on the Lower East Side made it visceral for me. A year or so before Sandy rolled in, I had interviewed NASA scientist James Hansen, the godfather of climate change science, who told me that if nothing was done to slow the burning of fossil fuels, sea levels could be as much as 10 feet higher by the end of the century. At the time, I didn't grasp the full implications of this. After Sandy, I did. Soon after my visit to Lower Manhattan, I found myself in Miami, learning about the porous limestone foundation the city is built on and the flatness of the topography. During high tide, I waded knee-deep through dark ocean water in several Miami Beach neighborhoods. I saw high water backing up into working-class neighborhoods far to the west, near the border of the Everglades. It didn't take a lot of imagination to see that I was standing in a modern-day Atlantis in the making. It became clear to me just how poorly our world is prepared to deal with the rising waters. Unlike, say, a global pandemic, sea level rise is not a direct threat to human survival. Early humans had no problem adapting to rising seas. They just moved to higher ground. But in the modern world, that's not so easy. There's a terrible irony in the fact that it's the very infrastructure of the fossil fuel age, the housing and office developments on the coasts, the roads, the railroads, the tunnels, the airports, that make us most vulnerable. One more. The tricky thing about dealing with sea level rise is that it's impossible to witness just by hanging out on the beach for a few weeks. Instead, the rise will make itself felt in higher storm surges, higher tides, a gradual washing away of beaches, of roads, of coastal infrastructure. Even in the worst case scenarios, the changes will occur over years and decades and centuries, not in seconds and minutes and hours. It's exactly the kind of threat that we humans are genetically ill-equipped to deal with. We have evolved to defend ourselves from a guy with a knife or an animal with big teeth. But we are not wired to make decisions about barely perceptible threats that gradually accelerate over time. In this way, we're not so different from the proverbial frog that boils to death in a pot of slowly boiling water. One architect I met while researching this book joked that with enough money, you can engineer your way out of anything. I suppose it's true. If you had enough money, you could raise or rebuild every street and building in Miami by 10 feet, and the city would be in pretty good shape for the next century or so. But we do not live in a world where money is no object. And one of the hard truths about sea level rise is that rich cities and nations can afford to build seawalls and barriers, upgrade sewage systems, and elevate critical infrastructure. Poor cities and nations cannot. But in this story, the central question is really about the complexity of human psychology. At what point will we take dramatic action to cut CO2 pollution? Will we spend billions on adaptive infrastructure to prepare cities for rising waters? Or will we do nothing until it's too late? Will we welcome people who flee submerged coastlines and sinking islands? Or will we imprison them? No one knows how our economic and political system will deal with these challenges. The simple truth is, human beings have become a geological force on the planet, with the power to reshape the boundaries of the world in ways we didn't intend and don't entirely understand. Every day, little by little, the water is rising, washing away beaches, eroding coastlines, pushing into homes and shops and places of worship. As our world floods, it is likely to cause immense suffering and devastation. It is also likely to bring people together and inspire creativity and camaraderie in ways that no one can foresee. Either way, the water is coming. As Hal Wanless, a geologist at the University of Miami, told me in his deep Old Testament voice as we drove toward the beach one day, if you're not building a boat, then you don't understand what's happening here.
Thank you. I think that sets the scene on a global level, and it's really great of you to have joined us here. So thank you very much. I hope you can stick around Up next is Monique Roffey. She is one of the key forces behind the October Rebellion readings in the Trafalgar Square. And she's a Trinidadian-born British writer, and her latest novel is The Mermaid of Black Conch, which has been getting great reviews. Her novels have been translated into 5 languages and won several major awards, shortlisted for many others. She's a lecturer in creative writing at Manchester Metropolitan University.
Real pleasure to be here, thank you. It's lovely to see some familiar faces. I guess, yeah, so I published a novel in 2011, and it was like an immediate response to something that happened to my brother, and he lost his house was destroyed in a flood. And in the aftermath, so was his mental health, and he lost his job, and so was his physical health. And, you know, and his neighbors, you know, it was just a whole neighborhood got destroyed. And he still lives in this house because he can't sell it because it's on a floodplain. So I kind of just wrote this novel. It's called Archipelago. And I'm going to read a bit from the flood scene, which is in the middle of the book. Okay, so here goes. Half an hour ticked past. The rain was a solid wall of water falling from the sky. He began to fret. The ground around them was already sodden from the afternoon's downpour. There was a storm drain behind the house, already full of churned up water. His neighbor rang him, also worried. His neighbor's house was even closer to the foot of the hill with no trees. We're sitting ducks, Gavin said on the phone. You guys okay? Not really. It's like a pond in my garden. Rain was like a war. He put on gumboots and he went out. He stood on his porch and he watched. Oh, fuck. Rumbles in the sky, great tearing sounds, and the clatter of an army marching, soldiers roaring. Trinidadians live with the rainy season. This happens every year. Half a dozen or so downpours this violent between June and December. Every year his neighbors ring him, especially in the last few seasons. He shouldn't worry. This will be okay. It's not unusual. He put on his waterproof jacket and he dragged a kitchen chair out into the sodden garden. And he climbed onto the chair and he peered over the garden wall. Oh God. Brown water, a river now raging down the denuded hill, water spraying and buffeting off his neighbor's wall. The street outside his house was a swollen river of brown. The floodwater was rising up the thin garden walls of his home. He jumped off the chair and he went back inside and he poured himself a rum and he knocked it back and then he poured another and he knocked that back too. Claire was sitting with Oceane on the sofa. She didn't want to look at the garden wall. She sat calm, her face composed. At one point, she got up and she went back into the room to peer at Alexander, and then she returned and sat down again. He's okay. It's best we don't wake him, she said. Gavin guessed she was weighing things up, coping. Claire always knew nothing bad would ever happen to her or those she loved. God was on her side. She'd had a tranquil and blessed life until that night. Hang on a minute. But he was fraught. His own fear was rising. The world outside was turning to water. Claire sat on the sofa as he paced the porch. He was holding his daughter's hand. Another of his neighbors rang. Same story. Shit, man, said Jeremy from across the road. His father lived with him. His father who was blind and autistic. My father's getting upset. Gavin considered getting down on his knees and praying. But more phone calls. Every person he spoke to was alarmed. Eventually, he could bear it no longer. Claire, I'm going to give Clive a call. It's time you all left. I don't like this at all. You, the kids, Josephine, Susie, I'm going to ask him to bring the Jeep. What, and leave you behind? I'll be fine. She shook her head. Look, I can climb onto the roof with a ladder. It won't be hard. I'm not leaving my house. But Claire didn't move. He saw that she couldn't. Something inside her had already shut down. She was still sitting still on the sofa with Oceane next to her when it happened. An almighty crack. He turned to see the concrete wall break open and the bricks fly into the floodwater, the wave of water like an athlete taking a hurdle, lighting landing tight, and then springing forward, racing towards them. Run! He shouted, and he fled, seconds ahead of the brown wave. Claire sat rigid, clasping her daughter's hand. Oceane turned to face the wave, her face lit up in terror. Run! He screamed. And then he was with them, and he had picked up Oceane by the hair and swept her up over his shoulder and dragged his wife from the sofa. And then the brown wave was in the house, sweeping through them, and he was hurled against a wall, thrown flat, water up to his chest. The Christmas tree was bobbing in the water, and Susie was howling, and he saw her paddling and gargling and snapping, and then she disappeared, swept around the same wall he was pinned against. And he heard Josephine in her room wailing, "Oh God, dear God, I don't want to die alone." Water up to his neck, and Oceane held above him on his shoulders, screaming, "Daddy!" And his wife also pinned against the wall, and the water was gushing now, moving through the house like a herd of cattle, swirling up against the windows, and there was a sound, the porous inner walls cracking too, and the rain doubling in intensity. I think I'll just stop there.
Thank you. I think that really brings it literally home. We've got an idea of this happening to cities, but also happening in people's living rooms, happening in suddenly and horribly, as you've conveyed there. Thank you very much. We're going to turn now to Susana Medina, who is going to bring us one of the voices from the past, the voice of time. She's been awarded the Max Aub Short Story Prize, International Prize, and her work was featured in the Best European Fiction Anthology. Her Dear Angelus Novus has been performed at numerous Extinction Rebellion sites, including the Edinburgh Fringe. And she's currently working with Rock Sanford, who will be familiar to many from Extinction Rebellion protests and organising. She's currently writing We Are the Asteroid, We Are the Dinosaurs, a dialogue about climate change and ecological catastrophe. So joining us now is Susana.
I'm going to be reading the ever-present J.G. Ballard, The Drowned World. And I've got a timer here, so it'll be 5 minutes. He had commandeered the reeds the day after their arrival, eager to exchange his crown cabin among the lavatory benches at the testing station for the huge high-ceilinged staterooms of the deserted hotel. Already, he accepted the lavish brocaded furniture and the bronze Art Nouveau statuary in the corridor niches as natural background to his existence, savouring the subtle atmosphere of melancholy that surrounded these last vestiges of a level of civilization now virtually vanished forever. Too many of the other buildings around the lagoon had long since slipped and slid away below the silt, revealing their gimcrack origins, and the reeds now stood in splendid isolation on the west shore, even the rich blue moss sprouting from the carpets in the dark corridors, adding to its 19th century dignity. The bulk of the city had long since vanished, and only the steel supported buildings of the central commercial and financial areas had survived the encroaching floodwaters. The brick houses and single-story factories of the suburbs had disappeared completely below the drifting tides of silt. Where this broke surface, giant forests reared up into the burning dull green sky, smothering the former wheat fields of temperate Europe and North America. Impenetrable Mato Grossos, sometimes 300 feet high, they were a nightmare world of competing organic forms returning rapidly to the Paleolithic past, and the only avenues of transit for the United Nations military units were through the lagoon systems that had superimposed themselves on the former cities. But even these were now being clogged with silt and then submerged. Perhaps it was this absence of personal memories that made Kerens indifferent to the spectacle of these sinking civilizations. He had been born and brought up entirely within what had once been known as the Arctic Circle, now a subtropical zone with an annual mean temperature of 85 degrees. The vast swamps and jungles had been a fabulous laboratory. The submerged cities, little more than elaborate pedestals. Apart from a few older men, such as Vodkin, there was no one who remembered living in them. And even during Vodkin's childhood, the cities had been beleaguered citadels, hemmed in by enormous dikes, and disintegrated by panic and despair. Reluctant Venices to their marriage with the sea. Their charm and beauty lay precisely in their emptiness, in the strange junction of two extremes of nature, like a discarded crown overgrown by wild orchids. During the next 30 years, the poleward migration of populations continued. A few fortified cities defied the rising water levels and the encroaching jungles, building elaborate seawalls around their perimeters. But one by one, these were breached. Only within the former Arctic and Antarctic circles was life tolerable. The birth of a child had become a comparative rarity, and only one marriage in 10 yielded any offspring. As Kerens sometimes reminded himself, the genealogical tree of mankind was systematically pruning itself, apparently moving backwards in time. And a point might ultimately be reached where second Adam and Eve found themselves alone in a new Eden.
Thank you very much, Susanna. We're now going to move on to Edward Platz, who is going to be, he's a writer and journalist and is the author of a brilliant book, Leadville, which is one of those very gently environmentally catastrophic books. It won the Somerset Warner Award and the John Llewellyn Rhys Prize. Most pertinently for us this evening, he wrote The Great Flood Travels Through a Sodden Landscape, which was a Radio 4 Book of the Week, and he's a contributing writer at the New Statesman. He's going to be reading for us now from The Great Flood.
Very nice to be here. Thank you, Toby. Yeah, so my book, The Great Flood, which is there, was about a travel book of a kind. I went around Britain talking to people who had been flooded, trying to get a sense of what it was like, to put some meaning to the stories that we hear on the news and all too often ignore. So it was about individual people's experiences, but it was also, I then tried to place those stories within the context of the history and mythology of flooding, the way we've always talked about flooding and so on. So the passage I'm going to read is about Doggerland, which is the drowned plain that used to connect Britain to Europe. So all along the east coast, between the east coast of Britain and continental Europe, the land that lies beneath the North Sea used to be called Doggerland. And one day I went out on a boat to visit the London Array, which is a wind farm which is being built in the mouth of the Thames estuary. And it was rather an inspiring visit in lots of ways, because they're very beautiful machines and they show what we're capable of doing when we put our minds to it. That may not be apparent from this passage, but that's the context. Anyway, the other thing I need to tell you is it was a very foggy day when we set out Okay, so it goes. We left Ramsgate in bright sunshine, but beyond the harbour wall, the mist closed in. A white bar of chalk hanging above the docks was the last glimpse of the mainland to disappear. The diverging trails of our wake were the only markers of progress as we drove across the sunken plain of Doggerland towards Long Sand and Deep Knock, the sandbanks on the edge of Black Deep, where the London Array was being built. I had crossed the North Sea before, by ferry, before the Channel Tunnel was built, but not since I knew what it concealed. The water was so flat and calm that I had no sense of how fast we were going. We might have been moored in a still grey pool, no longer than the boat. I imagined walking to the side and slipping overboard. Opening my eyes beneath the surface, I wouldn't find myself suspended in the blue vault of a summer sea, lit by angled shafts of sunlight, but in a cold grey fog that matched the one above the surface, hung with twisting wreaths of silt. While the boat circled to pick me up, I would sink again, feeling the vertiginous pull of the deep water covering the drowned world below. The scale of the land that was lost has only been acknowledged in the last 20 years. At first, archaeologists believed Doggerland was a land bridge, a promontory or isthmus connecting Britain to the rest of continental Europe. In the 1990s, an archaeologist called Bryony Coles proposed its true extent. She called it Doggerland, after the North Sea shoal invoked in the nightly prose poem of the shipping forecast. Darkness outside, inside, the radio's prayer. Rockall, Malin, Dogger, Finisterre, writes Caroline Duffy in her poem Prayer. Coles argued that Doggerland was not a remote, uninhabited place, but the heart of the continent. Yet there was still more work to do. Over the years, the oil companies that had hunted for deposits beneath the North Sea and built installations in its silty bed had collected seismic data mapping its terrain. But it wasn't until the turn of the century that we had the computing power required to convert it into 3D renderings of the lost land. As Vincent Gaffney, Simon Fitch and David Smith fed the data through the computers at the University of Birmingham and revealed the course of a river as large as the Rhine that once ran across Dogger Bank, they realized they were discovering an entire preserved European hunter-gatherer country, a lost land that at its most extensive was as large as the UK. Even before its submersion, it had been dominated by water. 1,600 kilometers of river channels and 24 lakes or marshes wound through the plain, which was dominated by the outer Silver Pit, a lake almost the same size as the largest in Europe. The marshy plain would have seemed bleak and featureless to the modern eye, but to Mesolithic people, it would have offered a rich living. Vincent Gaffney compared it to the Somerset Levels and one of the intervals between the incursions of the sea, when the land was covered by extensive areas of dense reedbed, wet carr, willow, birch, and alder woodland. The reeds, or withies, that fueled the staple industry of the Levels for centuries would have grown in Doggerland as well. And deciduous woodland provided edible fungi and fuel for cooking and warmth. The inhabitants would have picked fruits, nuts, and herbs, and hunted cormorants, mallards, grebes, and cranes. As the climate warmed, there would have been more animals to hunt. They caught fish and gathered shellfish on coasts and beaches. Much still remains obscure. Doggerland is one of the most enigmatic archaeological landscapes in the world, write Gaffney, Fitch, and Smith. They recognize that their work will galvanize fantasists as well as scientists, for it shows that the 19th century occultists who were preoccupied by the idea of lost lands beneath the sea were not quite as deluded as they seemed. We did not evolve on the continent of Atlantis, but we live on the edge of a drowned world, and we are descended from its inhabitants. Yet the rediscovery of Doggerland was not only an act of forensic skill, it was also a feat of imaginative empathy. Despite their warnings against reaching for conclusions that the evidence did not support, the archaeologists did not overlook the human dimensions of their discovery. They made me appreciate the sense of loss and fear the inhabitants of Doggerland must have felt as the waters rose. Though as the boat drove on through the mist, I reminded myself that there was at least one sense in which they were better off than we were. As the water from the retreating glaciers poured into the sea and drowned their ancestral homes, new territories were revealed on the low-lying land to the west and the north, which they had previously ignored. They had somewhere else to go. At the beginning of the 21st century, there are no comparable havens to explore.
Thank you so much. Thank you. You asked us to put our minds to it, and I think that's what we need to do. We need to learn to think in geological time. We need to learn to be inhuman about where we are in our temporality, because otherwise we are suckers. Claire Morrell is going to join us now. She wrote her first novel, Astonishing Splashes of Colour, and it was published back in 2003 by Tyndall Street Press and was shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize, which is like a vision of the future when small presses actually got close to the Booker Prize. It's been translated into 11 languages, and since then she has written 7 other novels, including The Last of the Greenwoods most recently, and The Man Who Disappeared, which was a TV book club summer read in 2010. And the reason she's with us today, her novel When the Floods Came, which is set in the Midlands in the near future.
Yeah, I must apologise that my novel has 2 catastrophes. One is flooding, which basically makes the country unusable for half the year. But the other one is a virus. So much of what the novel is that there's very few people left in Britain. And the story is told from the point of view of a family who live in a high-rise flat. And they can't go out in the winter at all, but they go out during the summer, in the hot summers, and they scavenge and they go on bikes. And so the bit that I'm going to read is they're setting off. They've heard that there is a fair somewhere. So the whole family, which includes Poppy, who is the father, Moth, who is the mother, and Rosa, who is the narrator. And they've set off cycling to where this fair is supposed to be. And they're actually cycling on a motorway. And they've come to Spaghetti Junction. Spaghetti Junction. I whisper the name to myself. It's perfect. A tangle of roads, carefully designed, winding and twisting in every direction, apparently aimless, but each one with a purpose. It's a meeting of motorways. They have all made their way here from different parts of the country and converged, consulting with each other, then threading their way past to where they need to go. Once, says Moth, these roads were crawling with cars, lorries, buses, coaches, lorries so big you could be at one end and not see the other. It's difficult to believe it all worked, says Boris, shading his eyes against the sun with a hand as he studies the patterns of bridges. It's so complicated. Actually, says Moth, it didn't always work. Lucia gets down from the tandem and runs to the side, leaning over the barrier. You can see for miles, she says. We're high up on a raised section of what must have been the M6, and we can see a very long way over a flat landscape spreading out to the horizon. Trees are flourishing, seeding themselves, forming a nascent forest across the land. They're thriving on the melted snow, revitalized after the brown exhaustion of the summer. A few isolated walls and crumbling buildings are still standing, small sections that were missed by the drone demolition or simply failed to collapse. These remains stand like half-dreamt ghosts, fragile and uncertain, eroded by wind and rain and snow, but somehow still managing to survive, clothed with the green uniformity of their surroundings. Weeds creep and spread, embracing everything in their path. And everywhere, as far as the eye can see, there are lakes, great bodies of water that no longer dry up at the height of summer, that contain enough water to spread and swallow every low-lying area, mining permanent beds for themselves, ready to be expanded by the next winter's torrents. From the opposite side of the motorway, we can see the city centre still intact, much of it coated with the same mossy green as the roads. The post office tower rising up through a confusion of buildings, several very high blocks of flats, the rotunda, the few remaining silver discs on the sides of the old bullring. You wonder why they didn't flatten the cities, don't you, says Moth. They're not much use to anyone in that condition. They're trying to keep a record, says Poppy thoughtfully. And to be fair, they wouldn't have known then how long we'd have to stay away. But it's becoming more like Stonehenge every day, all a bit mystifying to future generations. I'm hungry, says Lucia. Me too, says Boris. Let's have the picnic here. Good idea, says Moth. She unfastens the basket on the back of her bike and starts to unwrap the food. Once we didn't need maps, says Poppy. Satellites showed us the way, on a small screen. They'd pinpoint our exact position and tell us how to get where we wanted to go. What happened to them? Did they fall out of the sky? Poppy shrugs. I don't know. Maybe they just stopped working. Or somebody decided to deny us access, says Moth, because apparently we don't count anymore. She's always annoyed by this sort of thing, the passwords, the drops. They're willing enough to use our brains, though. We stand by our bikes and eat, all of us ravenous after our exertion, gazing out over the exhausted city that once held millions of people. It's beyond imagination. How did they all fit in? I sometimes doubt Moth and Poppy's information. It's as if they have to exaggerate to get our attention, always more interested in a good story than the truth. It'll all be forest one day, says Poppy, and he sounds satisfied. So there they are on the Spaghetti Junction in the middle of a motorway having a picnic.
Great, thank you very much. I feel like I've just been able to watch an apocalyptic dystopian version of Jack Norrie, both lulled and terrified at the same time. Also reminded of my powerful desire at school not to be given the role of Peas Blossom, but Moth in Midsummer 3. So thank you very much, Claire. We're moving on to Anushka Gross, who is a psychoanalyst and writer who practices in London. She's a member of the Centre for Freudian Research, where she regularly lectures. And she's the author, I think, crucially for us, a book we're all going to need, of a guide to eco-anxiety, how to protect the planet and your mental health, which will be published in June as an ebook and in paperback in September.
I was going to read two very short poems, actually, by Emily Dickinson that was sort of helpful while I was writing the book, because like anyone who spends any time thinking about the climate emergency, I got just incredibly depressed and anxious for the whole time of doing the research. So the two poems, actually, the first one's quite miserable, but like all Emily Dickinson poems, it's very, it's metaphorical. It's not about what it's about. So presumably it's, about unrequited love, about writing, about loneliness, about how unrequited love makes you do lots of writing, but it's also about fire and floods. So I thought, well, what if we took it literally and treated it like it was actually about what it's about? So it's poem 133. You cannot put a fire out, a thing that can ignite, can go itself without a fan upon the slowest night. You cannot fold a flood and put it in a drawer, because the winds would find it out and tell your cedar floor. So yeah, if you take it literally, Emily's right. If you ignore the fact that floods are coming, some floors are definitely going to get ruined. The second one is much nicer, and it's, I liked it because I suppose this question of hope is very big in the climate movements, and whether hope is rubbish and Pollyanna-ish, or whether there are kind of forms of active hope that can actually get things moving, or give people, I don't know, reasons to carry on. And there was a fantastic essay by an ornithologist called Janice Dickinson, where she comes up with lots of unorthodox ideas that, like harnessing that violence and passion of urban gangs to sort of towards climate activism. And another idea was harnessing the what she calls the charisma of birds, which when I read it, I thought it was a rubbish idea. You can't be serious. But I got a bird box, and actually Anna became a complete convert. Yeah, birds are brilliant and they give us hope. So this is Emily Dickinson's poem 314. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul, and sings the tune without the words that never stops at all. And sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could abash the little bird that kept so many warm. I've heard it in the chillest land and on the strangest sea, yet never in extremity it asked a crumb of me. And yeah, somehow I found that poem very helpful. So thank you. That's it.
Thank you. So we know now, whatever Max Porter says, hope is the thing with feathers, not grief.
Yes.
We're going to move straight on to Jessica Townsend then, who is going to read a piece which is non-fictional. Jessica is a key XR activist who's been part of the movement from the very beginning, and she coordinates the podcast, which does brilliant stuff with really, really amazing writers and thinkers. As a writer, she began as a playwright and has a feature film in casting to shoot next year. She's a graduate of the UEA Master's Programme in Norwich, and she also has a novel in development.
My father-in-law was called Norm, and he was, to be honest, an odd-looking man with wonky teeth and an amiable manner. He always wheezed a little because he had lost one lung to tuberculosis during the war. He adored a bargain and would bring out his latest triumph, a pair of leather shoes or a woolen jumper, and say, "Guess how much I paid for that?" and then chuckle at our inflated estimates. His son Chris, given access to the kind of education not available to Norm, became a doctor. He resembled his father, though he was a handsome, fitter, new coining of those genes. I was born into a big Roman Catholic tribe, and so the spare lines of my husband's nuclear family felt claustrophobic to me. But I had fallen pregnant at 19 with Chris's child, and they welcomed me in without reservation. They had a large square garden with an immaculate lawn and a path edged by tall fir trees, in between which my children used to run, while we adults drank tea or sherry and talked uncontroversially about roses or the weather. And we would wait for the huge elaborate meals to cook, because it was in the language of food that Norm and Vera chose to tell us that they loved us. And as we climbed aboard the car and through the Cotswold Hill, with sleeping children in the back seat on our journey home, we looked down at the River Severn snaking through the valley, and we didn't give it any thought. It was just part of the local scenery, like the beech trees, the bluebells, and the rabbits. Life seemed to move quite slowly, like a river itself, with a calm surface, but the route it took was sometimes unexpected. Later, I painfully divorced my husband. Our young marriage had proved to be not built on strong enough foundations, and it broke, and with it all our hearts. A decade later, Chris himself died in a flying accident, and our hearts were battered once again. I still had family in Gloucester, and staying over one Easter with my sister a few years later, she took me to visit the docks because the level of the water from the River Severn was dangerously high, almost running over the wooden walkways. There were crowds of people gawking just like us, but I didn't really see it as menacing. Rather, I teased my sister later that it meant that the most interesting thing to do in Gloucester on a bank holiday was go and look at a water line. But 2 years later, I heard that Norm and Vera's house had been flooded for the first time in the 40 years that they lived there. And it made me sad to think of the perfect lawn covered with water, the post-war furniture sodden and ruined, and the patterned carpets stinking. My kids were at university by then, so I only got intermittent reports, but it was disturbing to hear that Norm and Vera had decided to camp out in a caravan in the garden while the repairs were done because they were so scared of being burgled. I knew that if Chris had been alive, he would have insisted that they go to live with him. I worried about Norm spending a winter in a caravan with just one lung, and Vera, who was already showing early signs of dementia. I believe they had already moved back into the house by the time Norm took ill and died of pneumonia. My son organised Tesco deliveries from his office in Hong Kong, but Vera began to act strangely, hoovering the house in the middle of the night, and eventually her remaining son moved her into a care home. My daughter rang her every other day. When Vera sounded paranoid, she thought her son was scheming to take her things away or the carers were withholding food. My daughter took her down. I think it was these conversations, more than any drugs, that kept Vera's dementia at bay for those final 2 years. Vera said that she sometimes when provoked, would hear my daughter's voice, speaking gently in her head, saying, "Really, Granny? Are you sure about that? Maybe there's some nicer explanation." Global warming is not just ruining the lives of strangers in sub-Saharan Africa and in India. It is not just laying waste to the habitats of the polar bears, elephants and rhinoceri. It is already here, in Somerset, Yorkshire, Gloucestershire, Norfolk and London. It is in the local news bulletins. It is hiding in plain sight.
Great, thank you, Jessica. Our next reader is Josh Apinese, who is a screenwriter and director. As you could tell from his backdrop, full-on special effects. It not only wrecks, it also rules. Okay, he's made feature films, Female Human Animal, The Infidel, The New Man, and Song of Songs. Josh, take it away.
Thank you. And thank you all so much. It's really been some incredibly moving and wonderful readings. I'm here to just read some Emile Zola, an extract from his short story, The Flood, which I think will speak for itself. This is from towards the end. Turning, I saw Marie standing in her wet clothes. It was she who was laughing. Ah, the poor dear child, how sweet and pretty she was at that early hour. I saw her stoop, take up some water in the hollow of her hand and wash her face. Then she coiled her beautiful blonde hair. Doubtless she imagined she was in her little room, dressing, while the church bell rang merrily, and she continued to laugh her childish laugh, her eyes bright and her face happy. I too began to laugh, infected with her madness. Terror had destroyed her mind, and it was a mercy, so charmed did she appear with the beauty of the morning. I let her hasten, not understanding, shaking my head tenderly. When she considered herself ready to go, she sang one of her canticles in her clear, crystalline voice. But, interrupting herself, she cried, as if responding to someone who had called to her, "I'm coming, I'm coming." She took up the canticle again, went down the roof, and entered the water. It covered her softly, without a ripple. I had not ceased smiling. I looked with happiness upon the spot where she had just disappeared. Then I remembered nothing more. I was alone on the roof, the water had risen, a chimney was standing, and I must have clung to it with all my strength, like an animal that dreads death. Then nothing, a black pit, oblivion. Why am I still here? They tell me that people from Saint-Anne came towards 6 o'clock with boats, and that they found me lying on a chimney, unconscious. The water was cruel not to have carried me away to be with those who are dear to me. All the others are gone. The babes in swaddling clothes, the girls to be married, the young married couples, the old married couples. And I live like a useless weed, coarse and dried, rooted in the rock. If I had had the courage, I would say like Pierre, "I've had enough, good night," and I would throw myself into the Garonne. I have no child, my house is destroyed, my fields are devastated. Oh, the evenings when we were all at table and the gaiety surrounded me and kept me young. Oh, the great days of harvest and vintage when we all worked and when we returned to the house, proud of our wealth. Oh, the handsome children, the fruitful vines, the beautiful girls and the golden grain, the joy of my old age, the living recompense of my entire life. Since all that is gone, why should I live? There is no consolation. I do not want help. I will give my fields to the village people who still have their children. They'll find courage to clear the land of flotsam and cultivate it anew. When one has no children, a corner is large enough to die in. I had one desire, one only desire. I wished to recover the bodies of my family, to bury them beneath a slab where I should soon rejoin them. It was said that at Toulouse, a large number of bodies carried down the stream had been taken from the water. I decided to make the trip. What a terrible disaster. Nearly 2,000 houses in ruins, 700 dead, all the bridges carried away, a whole district razed, buried in the mud. Atrocious tragedies, 20,000 half-clad wretches starving to death, the city in a pestilential condition, mourning everywhere, the streets filled with funeral processions, financial aid powerless to heal the wounds. But I walked through it all without seeing anything. I had my ruins, I had my dead to crush me. I was told that many of the bodies had been buried in trenches in a corner of the cemetery, only they'd had the forethought to photograph the unidentified, and it was among these lamentable photographs that I found Gaspard and Veronique. They had been clasped passionately in each other's arms, exchanging in death their bridal kiss. It had been necessary to break their arms in order to separate them. But first, they had been photographed together, and they sleep together beneath the sod. I have nothing but them, the image of those two handsome children, bloated by the water, disfigured, retaining upon their livid faces the heroism of their love. I look at them and I weep.
Thank you very much. For those of us who are alphabetically obsessed like me, we have now gone from Regis to Zola. We have covered the entire alphabet. We are going to now jump backwards to C and D with Kath Drake. She is a poet and journalist, and she's been a passionate environmental writer all her life. Also working as an award-winning environmental broadcaster and journalist in her native Australia for over a decade. She's been running Writing to Buoy Us, B-U-O-Y Us workshops online to link up writers in Australia and the UK in these difficult times. Philip Gross described her 2020 collection, The Shaking City, as a guide to staying clear-eyed, combative, and caring in settling times. Kath is all those things, clear-eyed, combative, and unsettling. And she is going to read a poem to us now.
Oh, thank you, Toby. Yeah, I'm going to read from my new book that you mentioned, The Shaking City, from Saren. And I grew up in Perth, Western Australia, by the Swan River. And like many rivers, they have been impacted considerably by humans, named because of the plentiful swans, but now there are a lot less swans than there used to be. Lots of habitat destruction, dogs, all kinds of things. And the black swan is actually the state emblem of Western Australia. And like many other rivers, they're often named after the natural world, animals or plants, and yet we often forget just how precious they are, these natural features that we name so many things after. So that's sort of what this poem's about. And when I was an environmental writer in Australia, I did a lot of oral histories and found that people had recorded in their local histories, you know, buildings were built and places, roads were made, but no, they didn't actually record when the landscape changed, when the animals disappeared. And there were a lot that disappeared in Australia in a very short period of time after colonisation. So the river people, and the river people in the poem is the sort of a Aboriginal or a wider social, spiritual protectors or guardians of the river. The river people. One day, they just arrived. Camped for days on our river island waiting for swans, but none came. We don't know who they were, why they weren't moved on. They were sun-blushed, ethereal, used hand signals we'd never seen before. On our daily commute across the highway from island to city and back, we watched their canvas tents and sometimes a figure or two of a man, woman or child walking in the hot dust like a mirage. The bridge's heavy traffic drowned any sound of the birds, tides, their daily doings. We couldn't even tell them when the swans disappeared. Would you notice if a highway, a skyscraper, or even if the river vanished and there was just gravel under your feet? Would you still call this place Swan River? We felt their heavy ochre eyes. They made a swan shrine from a mass of grass, bark and reeds, its beak pointing skyward, long pampas grass feathers flying in the breeze, and every time we crossed the bridge, we felt the loss. Imagined their reflections in the water, swimming with the glossy black swans. One day, the river people just went. We didn't get to ask them anything, and the shrine eventually let go into the wind, blowing into the river, into our Swan River. Makes me kind of homesick as well. Thanks so much. So there's sort of a bit of an ode to my river back there and how wonderful they are.
It made me homesick too. It reminds me of a review of a Bruce Springsteen gig that was once on in London. It said, "This made me proud to be American, even though I'm from Yorkshire." So that made me feel, yes. We're on to James Miller now, we're deep into Writers Rebel territory. He is the author of the novels Lost Boys, Un-American Activities, and the Cli-Fi Sunshine State, and he runs the MA in Creative Writing at Kingston University. James.
Thank you, Toby. It's nice to be here. So I'll be giving a short reading from my novel Sunshine State. It's interesting because when this book was published 10 years ago, critics said that my depiction of the United States as a failed state wrecked by constant storms and floods, and with an incompetent climate change denying anti-science fanatic as president was unrealistic. And I also remember doing a few readings at the time when it came out, and there'd always be an irate American in the audience who would berate me for depicting such a terrible president and such a terrible sort of fate for their nation. Anyway, I'm just going to read a short part towards the end of the book, and the kind of conceit is that Florida has become a kind of zone outside of sort of any kind of control because it's so constantly flooded and buffeted by storms, and it's become this sort of mysterious place where all sorts of strange characters end up, and our protagonist is sort of sick and feverish, and he's tuning into this sort of radio broadcast brought out by this kind of messianic figure that kind of haunts the ruins of Miami. So here we go. After traveling all night, they reached the outskirts of hell. Tired drivers slumped at the wheel, eyes red searching for a dawn that never came. Hinterland of pornographic film studios and weapon testing facilities. Churches hunched between liquor stores and juju men with leashed wolves and alligator skins. Waiting. Huddled, languid postures on a barren concrete beach, gathered around small fires roasting flesh, and listening to the sluggish lap of water clotted as a clogged artery, thick with all the crap of the planet. Great chains of waste straddling the oceans. And floating above it all, the spectral airwave voice, a votive offering to the elements. We might think of Hurricane Winthrop as the start, the event that went beyond all expectation, the storm that shattered our predictions and revealed to us how late it was, how far our planet had slipped beyond our models, our restraints, and our reasons. We might. But it had already happened. It had happened, and it was happening, and it is happening still. Oh, my children gathered on the melancholy shore. Do you know about Cyclone Katrina? Not Katrina, not the fabled sinking of New Orleans, although that too was an augur of what was to follow, but Katrina, the first recorded cyclone in the South Atlantic. It struck Brazil 2 years ago now, all the way back in 2004, when many still denied the truth of their own eyes. when many thought we could still continue as if all was well and all would be contained. Katerina was nothing when compared with what has followed. Katerina did not vanquish any city, nor did it shatter an ecosystem, but it was what the scientists call a threshold event, a dire portent signaling an abrupt change in our climate system. He lies listening on the pallet, sweating and shivering at the same time. His nurse, veiled in purple robes, sits by the transmitter, plumes of incense sweetening the air around them. They listen. Experts had always said that conditions in the South Atlantic meant it was impossible for hurricanes or cyclones to develop. They said sea temperatures were too low, the wind shear too strong, but they were wrong. Look at the forces that surround us. Everything that is known, mapped and monitored, assessed and evaluated. All the comforts of projection and control are intercut and overshadowed by qualities not amenable to such measures. Instability is built into every system. Chaos rules the heart of all things. More exists in this universe without our knowledge than with it, and existence itself has an order no mind can compass. What can be said? Industrial capitalism, the excavation of the earth to unlock the power of the sun, the conversion of nature into disposable objects, the replacement of one system, organic and self-sufficient, into another, an engine devoted to the production of waste. All of this has unlocked powers so powerful that our planet has been plunged into an unknown realm. We have crossed a certain threshold. We have transgressed every law of nature. The climate has humbled our powers. Technology and reason waste away in strong wind and endless sunshine. Raw power and superstition bloom like poisonous flowers in the spaces left behind, and we wander through the undergrowth, corrupt gardeners tending to our delirious blooms. The voice is fading. All this has come to pass.
We have prophecy from you. It went from Ballard there, and it ended up in such a state that I wish I'd worn my Call of Cthulhu t-shirt, if only to give it one more airing, because it's one of the few clean ones that's left. Sharon Ekman will be joining us now. I think she may be our final reader. Sharon is a multitasking actor slash singer slash writer slash workshop facilitator. After winning Time Out Travel Writer of the Year, her non-fiction subsequently appeared in broadsheets of magazines on topics ranging from Namibian hunters to London science fiction fans. She has been longlisted for the Fish Memoir Prize twice, shortlisted for Words and Women Prose Competition, and the Jerwood Arvon Mentorship Scheme. She is currently, like approximately 10.35% of the nation, working on a novel. I'm sure hers will be better than almost all of those. Sharon.
God love you, Toby. Thank you. Hi, everybody. It's lovely to be here. So, Hebden Bridge in West Yorkshire suffered two devastating floods. The first in the summer of 2012 and again on Boxing Day in 2015. After Storm Dennis in February this year, local residents were flooded out again. And I'm going to read a personal account from Hazel, who was a volunteer flood warden in Hebden Bridge during the 2015 flood. In 2012, I walked into my hometown of Hebden Bridge with my little boy. There'd been a flood the day before. We'd stood at the top of our road and we watched the water come over the wall. Now we were walking through thick, stinking muck, and we saw people crying as they cleared out their shops and their homes. That's why on Boxing Day 2015, when the floods came again, I went into town again to do whatever I could to help out. I ended up working a roadblock on the main road through the centre of town. I watched the water rise quickly, higher and higher, inch by inch, then foot by foot. And things changed so fast. People came along hoping to get through, to save the stock in their shop, to get to their elderly mum who was trapped in her home. But the road was a deep and rushing river that would sweep you off your feet if you even tried it. I saw the anguish on their faces. I wanted to help them, but there was nothing I could do. It was hopeless. When the water went down, it left behind homes and shops thick with contaminated filth. It left behind destruction, carpets, furniture, new Christmas presents, treasured photo albums. It was all lost. In the support centre that the community set up, people walked like ghosts. They had no heating, no electricity, nowhere to cook. They had nothing other than what people gave. The community spirit was uplifting as people came from all over and gave all they could to help. There was so much love, but there was also so much loss. You can't begin to imagine it. There's nothing like it. In the weeks and months that followed, people continued to suffer. There was PTSD when the rains were heavy. There was financial loss. And some people just gave up altogether. There are old black and white photos of floods in our town, and some people make out that flooding here is inevitable. But it would be wrong to say that what we've got going on is natural. There are too many incidents coming too close together. I'm a volunteer flood warden, and year on year we're out more often under flood alert, clearing drains, diverting water, helping out when the roads flood and cuts us off. We all felt there was another bad flood coming, though they should fall 100 years apart. Climate change isn't a future event for us. We're living it. When it began to happen, it made me sick to the stomach. Knowing what it meant, knowing what it does to people, having to tell a woman that there was nothing more I could do, that her home was going to flood and she needed to get her kids to somewhere safe. Seeing once again people desperate to get through the roadblock, to their restaurant that was sinking, to a person who needed them.
Thank you, Sharon. We're going to hear now from Courtney Newland, who's written 7 books, including his debut, The Scholar. As a screenwriter, he's written 2 episodes of the Steve McQueen BBC series, Small Axe. His short story collection, Cosmogramma, will be published next year, as will his latest novel, which we're going to hear from, which we've heard from, A River Called Time.
Unlike her immediate family, Misty's divorced aunt opted for metropolitan life over the suburban comforts of Rochester Drive. Maple Court was one of 7 tinted glass and dark metal high-rise blocks that overlooked the banks of River Azile, or as it was known to old-timers, the Western River. The courts were built as homage to the fabled inner-city dwellings everyone heard so much about, their design specification drawn up by inner-city's lone architect, Maslow Knemu himself. Lattice steel balconies threw far-reaching silhouettes across early dusk sky. Bare, curtainless windows exposed spacious, open-plan homes, pastel colours, and ambient lighting. Marcus cycles at speed, forehead damp, legs a little sore, panting slightly, past security guards lined against the backdrop of the first 3 blocks. It would be next to impossible to get inside the blocks, though he kept sprinting. Closer to the egg-speckled concrete steps of Maple Court, he stowed, smiling as Remida got to her feet, wiping dust from her jeans and moving towards him as though it had been hours since they last saw each other. Nothing between them but the breeze. Hi. He wiped sweat from his brow, dismounting. Remida stood back, arms crossed. Hi. Guess you got a major squeeze when Seneth called my house while Mum's out playing a worry. He grinned, laying the bike down to walk over and enfold her in his arms. You? Correct? She grasped him tight, so Marcus was forced to speak into her hair, the light brown path of her centre parted, dotted with chicken pox freckles. 4 block security guards stared with open hostility. They wore black jumpsuits, their relevant block numbers printed on their shoulders, metallic face masks strapped around their ears, covering noses and mouths. The ELO manufactured products made the guards seem part reptilian and were often worn as luxury items by residents on this side of the city. Sharp memory of UK's coughs, bent over, holding the sweet counter with clawed fingers. Marcus had never been that close to an ELO Metro face mask, and he couldn't return the guard's stares. He carried too much hate for them to risk it. He said, "If that old butler then." What did he say? Her expression drew tight, almost ugly. "I didn't talk to that old butler, as you call him. I think he'd prefer housekeeper." I let him tell it to the answer phone and came downstairs. "You ride fast for a skinny guy." "Cheers." She squirmed against him, seeming uncomfortable, so he let her go, shooting another glance at the uneasy guards. "I just hope your cousin's all right alone. He's kind of weird." "Senna's a sweetheart, Marcus. He loves Misty. You don't have to worry. He would have told her off and left it." The guards had formed a tight group, heads low, their masks and helmets a series of dark, glistening globes like Dinian CCVS cameras. Clearly, they were talking about Marcus and Raymida. A quartet of guns strapped to their waists bore silent threat. Maybe we should." She grabbed Marcus without looking back, leading him away from the concrete steps. "Let's go by the river. Everyone's gone. We can talk." "Okay." He led him along the main road until they reached a grimy set of narrow steps. Moss-clad brickwork, mottled handrails on either side, ancient etched graffiti. Going up, they emerged into a man-made bank of river, wide enough for a parade that contained a mini-mart, a glowing pizzeria, and a taxi rank. Only the pizzeria was open, spilling stark light and the smell of baking dough. She walked him along the parade and on until it was far behind, a walk that took them to the sleepy business sector where ELO Corporation reigned. The company HQ was on the opposite side of Sardinian's corporate belt, the stretch of banks and stock exchange buildings collectively known as Southern Circle. Here, on the Western Circle, the computer giant still made its presence certain. Billboards high on glass tower blocks, sponsored buildings with glowing ELO logos, and parks adorned with corporation-funded statues of lesser gods and ancestors. Generals, philanthropists, and inventors mostly. Rival companies fought for space and attention, but they were next to lost amongst the bright sea of ELO Corporation vid ads. Immune to propaganda, or perhaps subconsciously absorbing what they saw, the friends kept going until they reached an empty bench that gave a lover's view of River Azile and the Twin Cities. Along the river from the west, a glitter of luxury apartment buildings spread that, if he'd known no better, gave an illusion of everlasting wealth, fairly distributed from the financial nucleus of the city to the furthest corners. Due south, as the river turned and travelled, a twinkle of lights emanated from scattered buildings, a world of steel, spotlit logos and glass. Beyond that, nothing. Gaps between corporate buildings awarded glimpses of a glow on the horizon, buzzed light exposing the grim fact that nothing else existed in that direction. Not buildings, nor people. ELO, with the aid of the government, had grown a glittering circular business centre to block the view of bare earth from sight and mind. Even the river had been made to disappear by the time it flowed into the Blin, forced underground by years of planning and engineering to pump through a network of inner city veins. Marcus often found himself thinking about the river, and whether others in the city imagined its plight as he sometimes did, diverted beneath the earth against its will, straining against demands, powerful yet robbed of strength, mighty though fallen. Whether it lamented the days when it had reached hundreds of yards from shore to shore, a whiff split by arched tunnels and concrete dams into canals and underground ponds, streams, and in some places, no more than a faint trickle of lank, bacteria-concentrated water. Life under immense pressure, even then. There was no doubt the river had fought, bellowing, twisting, and biting, until its strength gave. He imagined it asleep, devoid of anger or thoughts of revenge, a self-inflicted slumber in order to rebuild the energy of old, eternally dreaming of the day when it would rise. Thank you.
It was an immensely varied load of readings that we had, an immensely varied kind of approaches to this question, to this terrible threat. I hope you found it worthwhile. I hope you find it enlivening, entertaining, thought-provoking, and also sustaining.